I invite you to review the battle map as of the morning of November 11th, which is Tuesday. We'll summarize the past day. So today we'll talk about Pokrovsk, about the Kharkiv region, and about the Zaporizhzhia region, specifically about Huliaipole. That's a little preview. Please give us a like, write your comments, thank you, and subscribe to our channel. So let's get started. Pokrovsk. What's happening there now? Let's figure it out. Let's talk. Yesterday, Commander-in-Chief Syrsky stated that the enemy is now preparing for the final battle for the Pokrovskaya agglomeration. Supposedly, he is now amassing up to 150,000 of his troops here, he meaning Putin, because a decisive operation is being prepared in the Donetsk direction. The occupiers' task, supposedly, will be to encircle Pokrovsk and significant locations, cities to be precise, from the north. In fact, we understand that the key points here, the fate of the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration, is actually being decided, as banal as it may sound, not in Pokrovsk and not in Myrnohrad, but on the outskirts, primarily in areas such as, let me highlight them in green, Rusyn, Rodinsky, Krasny Liman, and Novoekonomikna. All these settlements, and of course here between Myrnohrad and Uspenivka, between Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, there is an important settlement, Rivne, which currently provides logistics for these two cities within the agglomeration. So the overall success of our troops depends on holding these locations. Today, we will talk in more detail and in a more structured way, referring to the analyst and Ukrainian Armed Forces blogger Kostiantin Mashovets, about some tactical aspects of the events currently taking place in the Pokrovsk and Nohoradska agglomeration. Because the overall outcome of those events is, in principle, suitable for discussion beyond the constraints of time, so to speak. These conclusions make sense. From the perspective of analyzing the situation and making decisions, we can consider why our commander-in-chief, who is currently leading the operation there, decided to hold the Pokrovsk and Nohoradska agglomeration. So what does the route suggest? To relieve the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration in order to secure these key settlements around Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, which provide logistics, it is highly likely that right now Commander-in-Chief Syrsky has taken up the issue of eliminating the Russian bridgehead on the western bank of the Kazennyi Torets River, which flows right here. To be honest, I personally thought that eliminating this bridgehead, particularly this section, yes, this section would be a task, of course, for our troops during the repulsion of their Dobropilya breakthrough. I think our command had similar thoughts, that as a result of the enemy's breakthroughs and their creation of footholds toward Dobropilya, we would eventually be able, through our successful counteractions and countermeasures, to drive the enemy all the way back beyond the Kazennyi River. You can see it's visible. In such a scenario, if we controlled the entire western bank of this river, it's clear that the logistics for Myrnohrad would be much, much easier. Both Rodensky, Krasny Liman, Razini, and Suvorove, all of these would be in our hands, and we would calmly establish a front along the river here, which, in principle, is not the worst scenario for setting up a defense along the river. But at the same time, if, for example, and by the way, Indu now, Mashovets suggests that the commander-in-chief, having arrived in this direction, taken responsibility for it, and now defending it, is in fact primarily trying to eliminate this very pincer that is hanging over the Myrnohrad-Pokrovsk agglomeration. At the same time, holding the northern part of Pokrovsk would yield us benefits, the benefit of being able to continue holding this fortified area. However, there are some nuances, so to speak, and Mashovets emphasizes them. Let's bring back the river boundary again so we can understand what is happening, where, and how. So here is the Kazennyi Torets River. Let's write it as KT Kazennyi Torets, where the enemy is already firmly entrenched. And that's why this plan will be very difficult to implement. First of all, there's the settlement of Razini, where the occupiers have a truly powerful fortified area. The Russians continue digging here, including the involvement of the 50th. The 51st Combined Arms Army, the 51st CAA, is advancing in the direction of Rodinske, and it is also exerting pressure, in fact, on Myrnohrad itself. The 51st Army is present here, and essentially, there are at least 3 Russian armies in this area. The 8th Army is also advancing in the area of the 8th Rusyn Yar, Poltavka, Popov Yar, and towards Shakove from Volodymyrivka, supported by Marines who were redeployed from the Kursk region. And right up to Pokrovsk itself, units of yet another army, the 2nd Combined Arms Army, are advancing. They are exerting pressure here. So essentially, our 7th Air Assault Corps, which is reinforced. The Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration is held by the 7th Air Assault Corps, which is not even fully manned here. In the Dobropilya agglomeration, it's the 1st National Guard Corps, Azov. And they are opposed by no fewer than 3 Russian armies. Clearly, these are unequal forces, and against such an imbalance, using symmetrical methods to push them back across the Kazennyi Torets River will be very difficult. As I already mentioned, referencing, let me emphasize, these are the thoughts of Kostiantin Mashevets, who, of course, adds a disclaimer that the commander-in-chief knows best, and he does not question the decisions. But in any case, it will be very difficult to accomplish. Further holding of the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration by relieving the northeastern flank and pushing the overhanging threat beyond the Kazennyi Torets River will be quite difficult to achieve at this time. Because the occupiers are firmly entrenched in Rusyn, the occupiers are putting strong pressure on Krasny Lyman without giving up their positions, and the occupiers are pressing on Rodinsky, although, to be fair, it should be noted that we continue to hold Rodinsky. And just recently, my colleague Yulia Kirienko, who is a war correspondent for 1+1 TSN, published a video where our tank was firing at enemy infantry on the northeastern outskirts of the town or settlement, after all, Rodinsky. So it cannot be said that this location is currently captured by the enemy. Our paratroopers are constantly clearing it in this area, and I even have the opportunity to show you this video of how our tank is working against enemy positions, against enemy infantry that broke through there. Here are the actual shots of our tank in action. We have a very powerful strike force of airborne units assembled there who are performing just fantastically, truly just fantastically. There are separate battalions of the 95th Brigade, the 79th Brigade, and in Myrnohrad itself, the 25th Airborne Brigade. This is just in the background, a bit of a digression, against the backdrop, so to speak, of the recent celebration of Air Assault Forces Day. And all those information attacks that were directed at the air assault forces amid the creation of the assault troops, saying things like, well, what about the air assault forces? They've outlived their usefulness. They're no longer a fresh concept in our military science, and so on. But it is precisely the air assault forces that are proving themselves in the defense of the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration. Perhaps the best way to define this, or at least one of the best, is by looking at the battles for Rodinsky. We just saw this video, and our troops are still managing to hold Rodinsky, but there is constant pressure on it and on Krasny Lyman from the direction of Razin. Similarly, the enemy is exerting the same kind of pressure on Suvorove, which is very difficult. And in this area, there is also pressure on Shakov, Volodymyrivka, and Rusyn Yar. It's very difficult, especially when the flank is also taking hits from the enemy, which basically leads to the thought that carrying out... Oh, and of course, the 2nd Combined Arms Army itself in Pokrovsk isn't exactly eager to give up any positions here to us, or even allow us to take at least the northern part of Pokrovsk. As a result, all this leads the author to the conclusion that, first of all, we have very few forces here. That our brigades remaining here in the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration have a very narrow corridor to ensure their maneuverability, particularly for a withdrawal maneuver. And the forces of all our units here are only just enough to prevent any further rapid and significant deterioration of the situation. And from the perspective that our resources here are limited, as I understand Mashevets, he suggests that perhaps the most logical scenario, who knows, maybe it will actually happen, would be this. This scenario involves withdrawing from Myrnohrad, shortening the front line, and thus enabling the possibility of taking the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk and maintaining stable control over Rodinske, Krasny Lyman, and possibly by narrowing the front line and the front strip, pushing Russian forces beyond the Kazennyi Torets River, at least in this area. Whether we will actually implement such a scenario, I don't know, but the fact is that right now, it is really very difficult to hold this defense against the Russians, although regarding Pokrovsk there are no good or correct answers. As I have said repeatedly, they simply do not exist. Let's talk about another area where the Russians have also gotten quite serious. Just the other day I was highlighting the problem in Vovchansk. By the way, yesterday I spoke with units that are currently operating in special forces mode in Vovchansk and on the flanks of Vovchansk, particularly in the area of Vovchansky Khutori. They say, in fact, that life isn't exactly sweet for the Russians here. So counting on Vovchansk being captured or encircled by pincers, as I previously assumed, may not be realistic. Well, for now at least, these scenarios are being postponed because our troops have mounted a timely resistance against the Russians in the Vovchansk direction. But at the same time, yesterday there was a statement from the founder of the Kraken unit, Konstantin Nemichev, who states, and this is in principle an obvious reality, that the Russians have entered and captured the border settlement of Bologivka, which is in the north of Kharkiv region. This is not only connected to Vovchansk, but also to these areas, and now the story is that the enemy has significantly intensified its activity in the so-called southern Slobozansky direction, if we follow the statements made by the General Staff in their daily reports. So the southern Slobozansky direction has indeed become more active, and the number of assaults reported by the General Staff shows what is happening here. This also directly concerns the border area. That is, from Bologivka to Milove, there are already buffer zones here in favor of the enemy, which he has established along the state border. Now the enemy is taking advantage of this and is entering here. In the long term, the Russian Federation has ambitions for this area, aiming to connect the Vovchansk direction with the Kupyansk direction. If Kupyansk falls, it is quite likely that Russia will pursue the Velikoborluk direction, so to speak, or at least try to implement this scenario to connect here and attempt to reach, among other places, Pechenyi, specifically this reservoir in Pechenyi, which was recently within their reach. Enemy drones. That is, this scenario is completely, well, I don't want to say that it is realistic. They can want to, but it will be difficult to implement it. It's difficult even from the point of view of the fact that there aren't that many settlements here that would allow you to hold on to them. So yes, there are villages here. These are not very densely populated regions, but in terms of large settlements, there are basically only about 3, Bili Kolodiaz, Praikolotne, and Veliki Buluk. Getting to them, to put it mildly, is not easy, but the Russians will undoubtedly try to create conditions for themselves to link these two directions, Luchansky and Kupyansky, as well as Dvorichansky. This is under the condition, among others, that, God forbid, Kupyansk falls. Well, these kinds of threats also need to be understood here. By the way, I talked about them back in the summer of this year. About the fact that, in fact, these Russian ambitions were already declared when they began to advance on the right flank of the defense of Vovchansk, in the Vovchansk hamlets and the settlement of Tike, when they started attacking Prikolotny with their drones and reaching here with fiber optics, when they were testing the so-called doomsday units here, which are essentially an analog, a cousin of Rubicon. That is, the Russians undoubtedly have ambitions for this section of the front, as they probably do for the Kharkiv region as a whole. This is also important. Keep this in mind. Today I will refer several times to things I have mentioned before. It's a bit like cosplaying a certain member of parliament, you know, who often says, "I told you so," or "I mentioned that." Well, there are things I really will bring up today about how this perspective could have been seen a very long time ago, but I'm not doing this to boost myself or to say that I'm some super cool, great analyst. No. The point is to show that certain actions are predictable. We know how to read this predictability, but so far we don't really know how to respond to it properly. So not only regarding the Kharkiv region, but I will also talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction, specifically the Huliaipole area, because recently, as you can see, a wide gray zone has appeared on the deep state map in these locations, stretching all the way to the settlements of Solodke and even to Rivnopilia, Novospenivske. The gray zone runs through all of these areas. This gray zone directly threatens Huliaipole. In other words, this is an entry into the rear of Huliaipole through Rivnopilia, a passage into the rear of Huliaipole. Well, first of all, let's note and clearly state that there was yet another army lie here. What was the lie about? Remember last week when Deep State released updates, I won't be lazy, I'll scroll back to those updates. It was about Uspenivka, about how supposedly Pavlivka and Uspenivka, well, Pavlivka specifically, on the night of the 4th to the 5th, Deep State changed the coloring for Pavlivka. This was the crossing of the Yanchel River by the Russians, which they had previously carried out, including in Uspenivka, and at that time the Southern Defense Forces issued a denial. What, are you discrediting us, the defense forces, certain maps, these intrigues, blah, 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 discredit us and claim that certain settlements have been captured there, but that is completely untrue? So, literally a few days after that, statements already appeared. Of the future commander, I don't know if he will become the commander or if, in principle, a decision will be made in favor of the assault troops or not. In short, the head of the Assault Troops Directorate of the Ground Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Colonel Valentin Manko, who, alongside this statement that supposedly, no, Pavlivka has not been captured, Uspenivka has not been captured, what does Manko say? He says that they, the assault troops, have cleared the settlement of Solodke. And he also says that those elite groups drove the Russians out of Rivnopilia. So you get what I mean, right? If the Southern Defense Forces say that there's supposedly no one here in Pavlivka and Uspenivka, then a big question arises. How did the occupiers suddenly end up in Solodke and Rivnopilia? So, well, it reeks of lies, doesn't it? Am I right? In the statements in particular of some of our spokespersons. But in reality, the Russians are present. Let's go back to today's deep state map. And right now, in fact, we can see how wide the gray zone is. That is, throughout this entire wide strip of the gray zone, the enemy's constant presence is actually being recorded. Both in Novomikhailivka and in Solodke. In Novikoleiv, according to Deep State, there is information that our units are blocked. The enemy is being recorded both in Rivnopilia, and all this monitoring leads to the fact that essentially the open field comes under threat. That is, this is really a gradual advance into the rear of the open field, especially since Rivnopilia is on high ground and Zeleny High is also on high ground, which would allow them to bring the open field under fire control for Russian drone operators once they appear here. Unfortunately, this trend was also apparent, and it has been for quite some time. Now, at this point, I'm really going to be a bit of a fortune teller, so please bear with me for a moment. I want to share with you a more detailed review of the battle map that I personally made and put together on August 19th. On August 19th of this year, which is the year 2025 here, I'll even bring it up directly on the map for you to see. As you can see, on August 19th, 2025, there was this review about what was happening in Donbas. Once again, here on August 19th, it's clearly visible, right? Let's now watch in the full screen mode that I was talking about then. As of today, I see the greatest such risks in Huliaipole because this settlement, the enemy is currently, as we can see, exerting some pressure in the area of Malinivka and Poltavka right here. This pressure is combined with pressure on the Novopavlivka direction in the area of the settlement of Temirivka, where the Russians have crossed the border between Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. And here you can see the latest change on the deep state map, the addition of an enemy-controlled zone in the area of Olhivske. All of this potentially creates pressure on the flank, on the left flank, and even on the rear of Huliaipole. In addition, in the area of Malinivka, the enemy will try to attack from the other side as well, creating a kind of pincer movement in order to attack Huliaipole from all possible directions. Well, actually, I'm just looking at myself a bit. It's like, you can sometimes catch yourself doing that. It's kind of funny when you watch yourself broadcasting your own videos, but in reality, this was on August 19th. So from today, how long has it been? September, October. Well, now it's already November. 3 months ago, this scenario was being discussed 3 months ago that the Russians would be flanking Huliaipole. I don't want to say that I'm some outstanding analyst or strategist here. No, undoubtedly. Our command understands all these things. We have a big problem. We don't have enough people. In fact, this advantage the enemy has in terms of intensity and pressure on a specific section of the front is making itself felt. And don't read a specific situation into this here. We are retreating on some fronts simply because we just don't have enough people. And especially when cases like the so-called Mindich Gate happen, I can only imagine the level of demoralization that spread through the troops in just one day yesterday when detectives from the National Anti-Corruption Bureau reported on such large-scale potential corruption schemes in the energy sector. So we have a lot of problems, a whole lot that we need to deal with. Well, that's about it. I'll end here. Don't get discouraged. Who else but us should solve these problems? At least from my side, through the media, I can, I should, and I must bring them to light, put them under the spotlight for you. Thank you for your attention. Please help us spread this information with your likes, comments, and subscriptions. Stay healthy, things are good here, and until we meet again,